TopMedTalk.
Well, hello, it's Desiree, Chappell, and Monty Mythen with TopMedTalk. Hello, Monty.
Morning, Desiree. From Sydney, Australia.
Yeah, we are in Sydney, Australia for the ANZCA meeting, the Australian New Zealand College of Anaesthetists and Faculty of Pain Medicine, their annual scientific meeting. Monty, it's a little bit different this time. Normally, we're in the same building doing this together, but we're kind of reminiscent of the COVID days where we were splitting the screen and you were on the ground and I'm joining from afar.
Well, the bad news, fun so far. The bad news for you, Desiree, is it seems to be working quite well. But we'll swap next time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I think we've had to divide and conquer on some of these things, but at least I get to join and see all of our friends. Some great conversations so far over the last couple days that are all on TopMedTalk. So if you haven't had a chance to catch up, please do find us on TopMedTalk.com or your favorite podcatcher. Monty, the theme of the ANZCA meeting this year is be connected. And I feel like every time we've had a conversation, you've really felt like that's really what it's been, coming together for the first time after COVID for the ANZCA group. Yeah,
and there's, as we've experienced at other meetings where people have come back together for the first time, there's extra energy in the room. I think we'll hear about that from our guests in a second, but the place is buzzing and people are taking the opportunity to catch up again. And the conclusion is that there's no real substitute for some face-to-face meetings now and again. Doing our bit from the point of view of carbon footprint by doing as much on Zoom and Teams as possible, but occasionally we need to get together.
Yeah, I think that's where the energies come in, really. I think the sense I've had, I think many of us around the world, is that COVID, I thought, sapped the energy out of a lot of healthcare practitioners, and that included medical researchers. I think we're slowly coming out of that, but I think there's like a long COVID effect on just that sort of personable side of what we do. And I think this conference has kind of reignited a bit of enthusiasm again.
So much happens through those hallway conversations that we have outside the actual meeting sessions, and Zoom meetings just prevent that from happening and having engagement with the audience. It's just fantastic to be back in person.
So I hope most people now have worked out who our two special guests are. Familiar voices. Do you want to go ahead and introduce them, Desiree?
No, that was fine. It's perfect. So friends of the TopMedTalk family, Paul Myles and Duminda Wijeysundera. Gentlemen, it is so wonderful to see your faces, even though I can't be in the room with you like Monty gets to. It just sounds like you've been able to really reconnect, and that spark is kind of going off for you guys this time around. Paul?
Yeah, exactly. I think for me, it's the best thing about a conference, perhaps like a busy operating room or department, is that face-to-face connection, and where you get your plans or your ideas get challenged a little bit more. So I always come away with new ideas, or I've revised some of my own thinking about a few things, and I think that's how progress happens.
Yeah. And it's really great. It seems like there are a lot of folks, familiar faces, but a lot of new folks too. Duminda, would you say that you have met a lot of new people this time around?
Absolutely. It's actually my first visit to ANZCA meeting and first visit to Australia. So yeah, it's new in many ways. And I think if I understand, this is the first in-person ANZCA in 4 years?
Yeah, I think certainly since 2019. Yeah.
So,
which wasn't in Australia, was it? So
that's right.
2018 was the last time in Australia, I think, or New Zealand. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's all a blurry past now in this COVID world.
It's hard. Yeah, it's like BC before COVID and after COVID.
No, the scientific content has been great. There's clearly a fantastic social vibe, and one thing that's really evident is the sense of community that you have in the ANZCA College is quite remarkable. And certainly from a Canadian perspective, it's really impressive to watch, and it's been welcoming. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we've always loved hearing what comes out of the ANZCA meetings, and when we get to catch up with a lot of the folks that are part of that organization in other parts of the world. So it's great. Gentlemen, we're here today to talk about disability and patient-centered outcomes. And Paul, I wanted to kick it off with you and kind of give some context around what that really means and the significance that plays kind of in our world these days.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's about that slightly higher level component of the work we do. We often focus on the technical the physiology, the pharmacology. A lot of our research has always dealt with that, and I think we do an amazing job given the complexity of the patients that we now have. But I've always felt that for me, what really mattered most of all is how the patients themselves experienced that process, both the preoperative preparation phase, obviously during the surgery itself, during the anaesthetic, but out to the PACU and beyond that time. So that kind of patient-centred focus for research, where we think about what could be patient-centred outcome measures, are really focusing around what the patient actually feels or functions in that, particularly that post-operative period. And not just for those first few hours, but obviously days, weeks, months, and perhaps even longer. So I've had a big interest in trying to sort of best work out what relevant patient-centred outcome measures would be in a surgical setting, both generic ones that could be applied for all types of surgery, all types of patients, but perhaps even looking at more disease-specific or operation-specific outcomes that give us a sense of that patient experience. And I guess that's been a part of my research for about 25 years.
So, Paul, one of the ideas that you were part of introducing over the last decade or so is the sort of days at home 30, days at home 90. They're becoming known as DAR 30, DAR 90.
Yep.
How's that played out? Has that worked out? Are you as pleased with it as you hoped to be?
Oh, I think it's been incredibly successful as one of the metrics or measures of effectively that patient-centred recovery period after surgery. I mean, it came out of this concept from the cardiology world, this days live and at home, typically for heart failure patients, for instance. So that the idea is not mine. It came from this sense that how many days can people spend out of hospital, and therefore as a indirect or surrogate or proxy measure of the success of the therapies in the longer term. And it sort of made sense to me that, well, okay, in our world, in the perioperative setting, in the surgical setting, the measure of success for us is as an expected full recovery in those days after surgery, so they can be discharged as planned back to their own home, their own families, and back to work. And if that's actually what we're trying to achieve, and if that's what would be a cost-effective healthcare system, then we need a measure of that success that is robust against, detection, under-detection, reporting biases, etc. So I sort of, with other colleagues, came up with this concept of the number of days at home in the first 30 days after surgery. Now, for that to happen, the patient obviously has to survive the surgery and not end up having a 30-day mortality, for instance. They also have to be able to be ideally discharged as planned and avoid readmission back to hospital. Because if they're coming back to hospital, first of all, you might miss that if you just use hospital length of stay, but equally, it nearly always indicates an unexpected or unwanted serious complication.
And in your healthcare system, Paul, is it relatively easy to capture that? Because some healthcare systems, Desiree may come to this in a moment, they find it harder to capture it.
That's exactly right. So there's an underlying assumption that if they have such a complication and readmitted, that they'll come back to the index hospital, the same hospital, rather than perhaps if they've come from a regional area, they might go to a different hospital for that complication. So that's where it might become difficult if you're relying on EMR data, for instance, or hospital data. When doing any particular study, and in most cases it would be purely a quality improvement study, not, for instance, a big clinical trial, then you have to at least understand that you might lose some of that information. But in most examples that I've seen to date, it's rather trivial. You're still able to detect what you're worried about, and that is effectively poor or failed surgery, really. Or, obviously not blamed on the surgical team itself, it's the whole hospitalisation process. So if patients, on the last part of the metric, which is perhaps I think also important, is that also takes into account if the patient goes to a rehabilitation facility of some sort, and most particularly a nursing home, which would suggest they might have been seriously injured and may never return to full function again. And we often miss that bit of the story, and it's crucially important for the older patient having the surgery, particularly. They really want to get back to their own home.
So I'll hand back to you in a second, Desiree. So Paul, we've heard it looks like it works in Australia.
Yeah,
I think it works in the United Kingdom because of the National Health Service, and even if you're not using the National Health Service, there is a single patient identifier that follows you through the system. Duminda, does it work in Canada?
Certainly within provinces. So because we have common health, although we have a government-funded healthcare system within Canada, it tends to be province-specific. Most times if people get admitted to a hospital and then discharged and readmitted afterwards, it would be at a hospital within the same province. So it's quite easy to do for most of our provinces within the country. I mean, it works much better to do it retrospectively. So, for example, in some of the trials that we're doing, we're using it in prospective studies, we still have to call patients to do it. Because if you want it in real time, that's how we had to do that. If you want to get it retrospectively, the data are at least about 6 months to a year late in reaching us.
Desiree, I may have taken us off piste a little bit there, but do you mind commenting from the US perspective, so we'll get the 4 different versions of this? How is it?
Yeah,
for you?
no, I think, first of all, I think it's really important that we do have this discussion, because that is something that it from the American perspective, it is very difficult to capture. I mean, you have Medicare patients that might be a little bit easier to track, but it still is very siloed and based on the system where they're receiving treatment. I think EMRs, if we are all on the same EMR, if there is that helps a little bit, and that's happening more and more. We still have a ton of facilities that run on paper. And so that's really difficult to capture them. So I think that we are starting to streamline a little bit and are able to capture some of that. I think to Paul's point, readmission is very difficult to capture, even in the same facility. We may not know that they've been readmitted. And so I think coming up with a way to look at this from a different lens or a different perspective would be really important. And to Paul's point, I mean, just because, we're looking at this and, someone could be going to a rehab and going home, but if in that 30 days they never do go home, where that ends up being what their discharge disposition was, I think will be very important, especially if we're talking about patient-centered outcomes, those outcomes that are important and most important to them. So that was where I was going to go with my question as well, is, there are a lot of limitations to some of the measures that we know are meaningful to our patients. In that it's difficult to quantify some of those things, or if we are, some of the questions that we're asking are very subjective, like pain scores and things like that. So that's where I know we've had a conversation before about trying to standardize some of the outcomes and looking at that. But, from both of your perspective, and I'll start with Paul, is how do we actually standardize some of these things that are a little bit more difficult to capture, especially if you're working within like a trials network or on these large trials?
Yeah, so I would argue, and something I think we haven't paid full attention to for a long, long time, is I think we need the consumer voice. We need the patients themselves to tell us what they think is important. And I think certainly a lot of the research that I've been following and some of our own research is this concept that they want to get home healthy. I mean, that's actually the reason they're having the operation in the first place, to both prolong their life but also improve their functional status and so on. That sort of feeling and functioning component of patient-centeredness. So I would argue very strongly that patients place a high value on this. If that's the case, then our healthcare systems need to redesign some of their data collection processes so that, in fact, that is real time, it is up to date, and there is reporting. Because even if you don't know what complications are happening or who did what or what's going on, if that metric indicates that they're underperforming or overperforming, then you know that that system is doing very well. And I think that, to me, would be one of the reporting measures that should really exist through both national agencies and so on, right around the world, really. It is a very simple amount of data to collect if you partly rebuild and reconfigure quality improvement oversight within a healthcare system. I think just coming back just from into my own world of doing large randomised controlled trials, in that setting, because we place a lot of importance on the precision and accuracy of those data, we follow patients. We do contact them ourselves out to at least day 30, sometimes 3 months, 6 months or 12 months, and we actually ask them when and if they've had any hospitalisations, how long they were in there for, and we get that information a bit more completely. So we place value of it for the robustness of our clinical trials. I would argue, why wouldn't any healthcare system place value on that for their own performance?
Paul, from the point of view of quality assuring the phone call, because if we take the Brits, for example, we can be having the worst dining experience possible and whinging about it. But when the waitress walks up or the maitre d' and says, is everything okay, we all smile and say yes.
Yep.
So how does one determine if the feedback from the call is truly a representation of how they're feeling, or do you just have to take that on the chin?
Well, I think just the mere fact of doing quality improvement of itself is a positive attribute, again, of a physician or a healthcare professional or a healthcare system. The fact that you are seeking improvement, our patients pick up on that and they place a positive value on that alone. The thing about having a metric like days alive and at home out to day 30 is that it's very objective. It can be audited. It is neat. It hasn't got that sort of interviewer bias component that might come into being asked by a pleasant nurse or other person, how do you rate your experience?
Duminda, cultural differences?
Yeah, I mean, there will be, I think, Canadians to some extent feel the need to be polite and may suffer from the same issue. But what I think is, I mean, and these are validated questionnaires that Paul's done a lot of work from his group in actually validating, including the WHO Disability Assessment Schedule. They have standardized items that have been shown to be able to detect, differences in function at home and so on. So we have external data showing that in various populations it works. And even the validation work he's done has shown that in individuals who are struggling based on other metrics, this seems a sensitive enough barometer. In a way, what we're trying to figure out, is this a decent thermometer to figure out that somebody's doing worse? And to your point about days alive at home, what we know is there's increasing data, as Paul pointed out, showing actually we need more data on what patients' perspective of success means. And there was a talk I gave yesterday, and we talked about a study. That was a study led by a group in McGill in Montreal, in Canada, which actually just interviewed patients to find out what defines success to them. And what was striking is, of the 5 domains, only 1 pertained to physical symptoms. And so everything else was regaining independence, overcoming the mental strains of surgery, being able to enjoy life. So they're already telling us, and this was just 30 individuals across 4 countries, we need more work like that. But I think it highlights that what we gather from our clinical experience, that patients value that, is true. But there's always going to be a trade-off between the ability of an instrument to detect what we're interested in versus feasibility, and that trade-off always exists. So even Days Alive at Home, I think, is a simplified instrument, because the ideal way is to actually have instruments that measure disability and quality of life. That becomes really challenging to do. So in a way, DAH is a proxy measure of that. There are some trade-offs, but these are the compromises you make, because I'd say they're imperfect, but right now we're not measuring it at all.
So in the UK, one of the things that we've tried to do is to bring a measure right forward so that it's more tangible and immediate to the providers. And you may have seen that Ramani Munasinghe and colleagues published recently on the DREAM, Drink, Eat, Move, as a sort of proxy measure for the immediate post-operative team is doing well. And it looks like that impacted DAR 30. We can't say that exactly yet, but if you look at the length of stays and what happens next. Any thoughts on that, Paul, as a sort of immediate, something that's it's quite hard for the immediate providers to get their hands on DAR 30?
Yeah, so firstly, I'm a big supporter of the DREAM concept. Yes, absolutely. I don't think we've really got a head around exactly characterising the whole recovery trajectory. So whether it's simple ambulatory surgery for an otherwise healthy person, where you just assume it's all going to go well, and it mostly does, but obviously much more so for the frail elderly undergoing more extensive or major surgery, where it's high stakes. It's very high stakes. I mean, it is literally life and death for them. So having a sense of where in the process are things starting to go wrong, where are there moments in time where we can intervene and change that trajectory back to normal. So, this ties in things like, rapid response teams or, medical emergency teams. And obviously, patients being admitted to a HDU or an ICU environment, they get more specialised care and so on. But equally, on a ward sense, a surgical ward where there might be delays or missed opportunities to avoid dehydration or delirium or falls. These sort of aspects we need to better follow. And there's no doubt, I think, there will be a link between that early functional recovery that will be picked up by dreaming and, I guess, protocols in place that facilitate and support that, out to a complication-free hospital stay, which might be the next 3, 5, 10 days, and then being discharged as planned. And I think then following out to longer-term disability-free survival would then give you the whole story, and then we can look at the moments in time where the healthcare system simply needs to be better resourced or modified to try and keep people on that healthy trajectory.
Because we were catching up with Guy Ludbrook, and myself and Desiree were talking about it and looking at his JAMA surgery publication, which has just come out, about more intensive care. And I don't mean going to intensive care, caring for the patients more intensively in the first 24 hours after surgery. And when we were socialising that with Guy, he seemed to be questioning the mechanism as to why it seems as though the effect is lasting out to 18 months and beyond. Thoughts on that, Paul, and then Duminda?
Yeah, again, I think that's one of the reasons we started working on the disability-free survival concept, and Duminda's doing amazing work himself as well in this area, is that, again, I think many clinicians would feel that if you get off to a bad start, like a marathon, if you are stressed or injured or damaged in the early part of that process, you are simply not going to make it to the finish line. And that's what I think we're aiming to do with surgery more generally. We want to improve that disability-free survival. So again, we need to understand where is it that we can try and get that trajectory back again or protect it. There may well be, inflammatory processes that are irreversible or set up a genomic response that programs, cell death, organ injury, and therefore chronic kidney disease and so on. These aspects come in. Obviously, there's a relationship between delirium and longer-term cognitive deficits. All of this plays into a similar story. So I think really high-quality care, which we've mastered, I think, in the intraoperative period,
yes,
needs to go at least out to that first 24 hours for all patients, particularly all at-risk patients. And obviously, if there's resources available, you'd extend that further.
And what's the status in Canada, for example? I know you can't speak on behalf of the whole country, but in the UK, we still seem to be battling to get appropriate resources to provide the level of care we'd like to give to our patients after major surgery.
And we have the same thing. I mean, I think we've got intermediate levels if you look at per population basis in critical care beds, but access to critical care for major surgery is a major issue across major hospitals. And in addition, I think the concept of that intermediate care unit where you don't need what you call a level 1 unit, you need something that's somewhere in between. We do need that, and I think information from the study that you mentioned and others, I think will help, frankly, build the business cases that we need to get hospitals to fund it. But I think to that point, as well as what you mentioned about the dream concept, I think the important thing, those are things that we, like recovery and disability after surgery is very, very multidimensional. And chances are we can only act on some components of it as perioperative physicians, but we need metrics that are actionable for us. So if we can achieve DREAM, then we can feel that we've moved forward, because in truth, there's so many other things that can impact on patients afterwards we can't move forward on. And I think we need to get those early measures of a process success. I think just to touch on that, one of the things, in addition to us improving what we do in the hospital, is some of the work we're just completed recruiting for a large cohort study of older surgical patients. And we're measuring disability for them for a year after surgery, inspired by a lot of the work that Paul has led. But one of the things we've integrated is a qualitative component where we're interviewing individuals with frailty and their family members after surgery. And what is remarkable, and it makes sense, is some of the major drivers for difficulty is limited social supports and resources, patients at home who are struggling with wound care, yes, and then the infections develop and then they come back in. And the marginal gains we can make in just addressing those major gaps in people with limited supports are massive. And when you think about the perioperative medicine model, obviously we wouldn't deliver that, but the ability for us to identify those individuals who need something more than you've had your surgery, go home, and good luck with things is something that we've got to fill.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, and this is something I've experienced when we were starting our enhanced recovery programs, is that now we're really but expecting patients to go home more quickly. And whereas they were in the hospital for 7 to 10 to 15 days whenever they were having a big colon procedure, and now they're leaving on day 2, they had 7 to 10 to 15 days of somebody looking at their wound every 8 hours, and somebody making sure they had 3 hot meals, all the water that they wanted to drink. And now they go home with very limited resources. And I know Monty, we've talked about this in the past, that, his mom used to go and check on patients at home once they had left the hospital. No one does that much anymore. I think we're trying to do that here in the U.S. And setting up hospital at home systems, but would love to hear kind of, Duminda, your take on this as well. I mean, if we are really pushing people out, like, how are we going to use, and tying this all back together, how are we going to use some of the what we're seeing in patient-centered outcomes and looking at those to really impact the disability-free, survival of our patients throughout the course of their, post-op journey?
I think it's a complex question, but I think one of the things we've noted from the studies, we've measured even at baseline measures of social support that they would have at home. And actually, as clinicians, we know when you're dealing with an individual who lives by themselves, they don't have much family in the city, or they're far away, you're going to run into trouble. And we assume everybody's the same. We do. People would rather be at home, but it's completely different. Like when you push people out of hospital early, it magnifies the disparities based on socioeconomic differences that clearly exist. And so it may be cheaper, frankly, from a health funder perspective, to fund that in a targeted way. Obviously, if you are resourced and you've got family, you don't need it. But it's probably easier to target that than to deal with readmissions. And then to fill that gap, I think we need data to make the case to hospitals like this makes sense from many perspectives.
So, Duminda, do you have district nurses or the equivalent in Canada still?
We have what is called community outreach nursing, which is it's the same thing. It's very, I don't practice outpatient medicine. The reviews from my colleagues are that it's mixed and people have to advocate for it very aggressively. And you can sort of see it tends to be the ones who are more educated, who have larger families, for whom English is a first language, who can advocate for that. And it sort of, again, it magnifies some of those disparities that exist within our system. So we need to be able to provide that much more systematically. At least in Canada, it's often done on not on a proactive basis, but a reactive basis in many centers. People run into trouble and you're trying to figure it out. Whereas if you had good care planning, you would have planned this in advance.
And Paul, because what Desiree is referring to is my mother was a district nurse.
Yeah.
And via the general practitioner, every patient after major surgery, you'd had a longer hospital stay anyway, back in the day.
Yep.
When they were discharged via the general practitioner, and everyone automatically got a visit from the district nurse.
Yes.
And if they had no support, they got a daily or twice daily visit until the wound was healed.
Yeah, so in the Australian setting, and again, it might differ in different parts of Australia, but the essential model is the district nursing model, but we label it now as hospital in the home. So it allows patients to be discharged even though they might still be on intravenous antibiotics or need wound care and so on. So that is reasonably well planned within the discharge planning process according to need. And certainly in our hospital, it works quite well. It does give confidence for both enhanced recovery and early discharge, and also mechanisms in place to try and troubleshoot and avoid return to hospital. So to me, that comes back to the discussion we were having before about days alive and at home, is that and why it is such a good quality metric, is that you can both use that as a performance measure of avoiding readmission and so on, or going to a nursing facility, not their home. And equally, to come into Duminda's point about the kind of social needs that might be quite specific, it may well be that certain demographic groups clearly have a greater need for that to be built into discharge planning as part of a high-quality hospital.
Desiree, I'm just looking at the clock here, and I just want to check first if anyone wants to say anything else about disability and patient-centred outcomes, because I want to see if we can get a rapid update on big trials that are about to report or have been started. But I just want to make sure we've dealt with the disability and patient-centred outcomes first. Paul, anything else to add at this stage?
Again, I'd just like to emphasise the point, we need to listen to our patients and obviously their carers and families as well. And I don't think we've done enough of that in the past. There have been some people who have been dedicated to it, but by no means enough. And I think we sometimes lose the patient's story in some of the hospital processes, procedures, or even some of the research we're doing. And I think we have to retain that. And that will guide the sort of research they want to improve their care. And I think we need to listen to that.
Not so much. I don't have anything in the way of trials to report, but as I mentioned, we just completed recruitment for a cohort of 2,000 older surgical patients in Canada. We call it the Fit After Surgery Study. The protocol paper's been published in BMJ Open, so we'll likely finish follow-up around this time next year. But one of the things we're going to be able to do is measure disability trajectories in all of these individuals, but measure other things such as actually their quality of life. But an important thing that we're measuring is actually decisional regret based on other outcomes after surgery and their disability status at 6 months and a year. Would they reappraise what their original decision was? This is not to help just tell people not to have surgery, but I think one of the original sort of reasons why I got into this research, and I was inspired by a lot of the work that Paul did, was I often saw patients pre-op and actually took care of them for surgery who were vulnerable, had a lot of frailty, and we could tell them we can get them out of the operating room, and that's success. But you knew, or you had a strange sense this was not going to go well to them, for them over the long term. And we had no data to be able to inform them in a quantifiable manner what to expect. They may still choose to go through the process, but they have a right to know what that likely path forward would look like.
Regret rates, do you have any sense of that yet, Duminda?
No, we haven't looked at those.
Desiree can give you a little update in a second on some anecdotes about regret rates, but any notable
I can't.
Benchmark?
We don't have those yet, but I'd be very curious to see what you have to say on that, Desiree.
Are you able to share anecdotally without naming names a recent survey that we talked about, Desiree?
Oh, which one are you referring to, Monty?
With one of your colleagues. Well, I'll give the headline result. It was a 40% regret rate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
I
don't want to name names and places.
We need to listen.
I was just going to say, I'm not going to say much more.
But I think we'll get to see that data.
That's shocking. Wow.
Are we that surprised? Hopefully in our systems we'll have lower regret rates. We're not going to have no regret rates.
Yeah. It's a call to action, though. That's what I think.
Yeah.
When I hear that, we should stand up and listen, and we need to urgently focus our attention on what's going on.
So Paul, very briefly... Sorry, Desiree, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say very briefly in finishing, what we're going to get the results, for example, of Optimise 2 soon.
Yep.
Which is the large multi-centre trial led by Rupert Pearce et al. We're hoping, we know we're going to hear the results in July at EPOM London, but we hopefully the reviewers will see the results before that, which would be great. So none of us know what's happening there, so we don't read anything into that. What else is coming down the road?
So at lunchtime today, our ANZCA Clinical Trial Network are having an update meeting to talk about all the big trials we're doing at the moment. My two little hot tips for this year. Firstly, I'm part of a group. It's outside the ANZCA CTN trial group, but I'm one of the investigators on the PATCH trial. So this is a pre-hospital randomised, multi-centre, multi-international randomised controlled trial of tranexamic acid given pre-hospital at the scene of the accident, so much earlier than the crash trial. Obviously looking at disability-free survival effectively as the primary endpoint. Those results are being presented in mid-June at a big Belfast critical care meeting. And the results have been accepted and will be published on the same day in a major medical journal.
Yes.
So look out for that one. I think that will really have an impact on trauma management.
Yep.
The second one is my little passionate DEX2 trial, which is the high-dose dexamethasone for cardiac surgery. We used a very innovative novel design done in collaboration with Stefan Dielerman, who's the scientific convener of this meeting. That's a binational randomised controlled trial. We've completed all the trial. The data's being cleaned. I expect to be writing the manuscript in the next month or so. I don't waste more than a week doing that kind of work. So I'll force it through the publication system and hopefully again in a major journal later this year.
Brilliant. Now, what else is up and running?
Oh, well, there's probably two now. I mean, the great success story of, I think, these large pragmatic trials are now happening all over the world, which is fantastic in anaesthesiology, perioperative medicine. We're doing, of course, the rocket trial itself is being done, led by Phil Payton, looking at ketamine infusion to prevent chronic post-surgical pain. I might stop there, actually, because there's so many. But I'll self-promote one more time. Our ITAX trial, 1,000 patients randomised to intravenous iron or not for elective cardiac surgery for those with anemia. We'll complete enrolment later this year. There is, I think, a 3 or 6 month follow-up period looking at the full recovery trajectory after cardiac surgery. So that, I hope, will certainly be published next year.
So in closing, because we picked it up in an earlier conversation with Steve Webb and Doug Campbell about alternative trial designs, and particularly in the Prato meeting last year, you started a touch, Paul. This is the meeting you organised in Italy for clinical trial specialists about the potential for having platform trials in surgery, for example.
Yeah, so again, the great success story, I think, in this platform trial concept has come through the REMAP CAP group, which I guess you've heard about.
And we recorded if people want to listen to the podcast, we went into that in some detail about how they kind of work. So
I've known Steve Webb for a long time. We're very like-minded about these pragmatic clinical trials that actually tell us what we need to know to improve patient care. And I really believe that in the perioperative medicine world, that we can have trial platforms that allow us to very efficiently ask questions and just roll over both the trials themselves or adding in new interventions to test within a randomised design within a single infrastructure. So we're working closely with the groups in the UK and in Canada and probably elsewhere to have what I hope is a shared platform system that we can all join in on and share the expertise of statisticians and databases and optimal trial design to really pump out really reliable results at a faster rate.
Great stuff. So if and when that's built, which I'm sure it will be with the people involved, and we want to join in, how might one access that and how might it manifest itself?
Well, you just need to be a nice person. And by that I mean you need to be open to collaborate. You need to share. You need to join a team and be part of a bigger story in which everybody benefits. So I think that's where I think these collaborative trial processes really give us the greatest opportunity to actually give us reliable evidence to change practice.
And do you think industry partners might be able to start to come to you to say, can we work together to address some real questions about the value of these devices or drugs or interventions?
Yeah.
Or, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, the sort of R&D costs of both big pharma and the device companies is so, so expansive, and there's such a long lead time to set up to get the information they need to both market and, and promote their products. So, of course, I mean, I would see there'd be great cost efficiencies and probably, again, partnering with the providers, the actual doctors and nurses and that working and using these drugs and techniques and so on to actually, again, give a fast-track process of new knowledge.
We were having a little side conversation before you arrived, Paul, about whether it might end up being procedure-specific. In other words, spine surgery, for example, and even narrowing that down to certain type of spine surgery might give a greater chance of answering a question.
Exactly right. And the concept of an adaptive platform design is that you can modify through the progress of the trial as new information comes in to actually fine-tune the type of patients you're studying or one type of surgery where there seems to be a particular benefit. And, of course, you can stop the types of surgery where there is no evidence of any benefit. So it's got much more plasticity, and it greatly improves the efficiency, but protecting reliability. It protects against any biases.
So just to give an example, we side conversations we've been having, which are common around the world now, about the increased use of vasoactive agents perioperatively. Phenylephrine in particular. It sounds as though one would be able to answer that question fairly quickly. Because if you use metaraminol or ephedrine or peripheral norepinephrine as an alternative, you can look as you go, and if there is a signal of benefit or harm, you can drop things out and put things in. Is that roughly the idea?
I mean, it's like we're sort of turning on the headlights. And through the fog, we're actually now getting a clearer sense of where we're going as we're driving, such that we can modify that direction based on accruing evidence. So based on reliable, randomised data.
So we don't have to wait to get to the 3,000 and 3 years or whatever it is, then break the code and go, dang, we could have...
So we'll still get the 3,000 in 3 years, but we'll answer 3 or 5 or 10 questions, not one.
Fantastic. Dominda?
No, I think it offers huge opportunities for actually answering questions flexibly. Even take the example of the vasopressors. In our traditional approach, we're typically bound by the two arms. But you can easily envision a scenario where you have 3 or 4 options. And as data accumulate, you may drop arms because you've realized they're entirely futile, and you can focus the information on the two arms that matter without dealing with some of the challenges. I mean, there's always a price to pay, but the statistical models, especially with using Bayesian approaches, allow you to do this in a way that's valid. So I think it has huge opportunities. I think a lot of there are some practical challenges that we've sort of encountered just with supporting the REMAP CAP group in Canada, that the data infrastructure is complex and actually has been built very recently, but we would have a lot that's been learned already through the critical care community. And I think most importantly, the sense of collaboration, because I think ultimately you have to agree that sometimes you're going to be able to support other people's trials because that's their questions, but it allows a collaboration when you're going to be able to use that same platform to answer questions that you might be, as a principal investigator, more interested in. So I think it's reliant on collaboration, but it really facilitates it.
So Desiree, as one of the leaders in quality, your title, I think, is what's your title at North Star, Desiree?
Vice President of Clinical Quality.
Yeah, and your anaesthesia group's about the same size as the National Health Service, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. We have over about 200 facilities and almost 3,000 providers.
Wow.
So sounds like you might want to play platform.
I know. The wheels have been spinning the whole time trying to figure out how we
this could be Google for you. This could be big.
So Desiree, do you want to bring us home?
I do, yes. Paul Myles, Duminda Wijeysundera, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you guys letting me join from afar. Monty, thank you so much for holding it down there on the ground. We really want to thank 3M and ANZCA for supporting TopMedTalk to be at the meeting, the annual scientific meeting this year. It's been wonderful, great conversations. If you want to hear more, Check us out at TopMedTalk.com. We're on your favorite podcatcher. We're on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We are there. Gentlemen, again, it's always such a pleasure to sit down. I know this went a lot longer than we had anticipated, and I'm sure we probably could have talked for another hour or so. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your meeting, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Cheers.
Thanks, Desiree.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.